The year was 1888. The place, a dusty train platform in Ohio, where the scent of coal smoke clung to every coat and corset. A man stepped off the train with polished boots, a rose in his lapel, and a plan so outrageous it would one day become legend. His name was Mr. Lysander Shaw, 35 years old, unmarried, undeterred. Lysander had a theory that love, like lightning, didn't strike just once, it struck wherever you pointed the rod. And he intended to test that theory. With a leather satchel full of letters, a fountain pen, and his best coat freshly pressed, he set out on what he called the Week of Affections. He would travel from town to town, 7 towns in 7 days, and in each town, he'd propose marriage to as many eligible women as he could find. The first town was Eldon Grove, a village so small the blacksmith doubled as mayor and midwife. At the general store, Lysander approached Miss Tabitha Cleves, the shopkeeper's daughter, who was restocking shelves of pickled onions. "Madam," he began, straightening his lapel, "I've seen many fine women, but none whose posture so commands the soul." Tabitha blinked. "You're proposing?" He knelt beside the barrel of flour. "I am." By lunchtime, word had spread. Lysander had proposed to the baker's niece, the widow who ran the millinery, and even the town librarian, all within 3 hours. That evening, he was invited to a town dinner. Not out of affection, but fascination. The townspeople gathered like spectators at a carnival. Lysander was asked to stand and explain himself. With confidence bordering on madness, he rose. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe romance has grown sluggish in this modern age. Courtship is stifled by caution. I say, let the heart leap." There was silence. Then someone clapped. Then more. Even the mayor blacksmith midwife nodded. He left Eldon Grove the next morning with a spring in his step and 4 tentative yeses. But that was only day 1. What came next would stretch even his eccentric charm to the limit, and catch the attention of newspapers, ministers, and eventually, the law. Because in day 2's town, his name had already arrived before he did. And not everyone wanted to be proposed to. No one knew exactly when Henry began keeping score. But by the time Monday morning broke over the rooftops of Boston, he had already proposed to 7 women, 1 for every day of the previous week. And now, with a crisp waistcoat and a pocketbook full of rejection, he stepped onto the cobbled street with something dangerous in his eyes, momentum. What started as a whim was becoming a game. Each proposal had been different. To the bakery girl, roses and a sonnet. To the apothecary's daughter, a quiet ring slid across a tea table. To a laundress near the docks, a dramatic knee drop that startled 3 passing sailors. But none had said yes. And Henry, oddly, looked pleased by that. "You're still at it?" his barber asked, half in jest, as he powdered Henry's hair with chalky white puff. "Still." Henry grinned. "I'm just getting started." By Tuesday, he had his rhythm. 3 proposals before lunch. 1 at dusk. And always, the same glimmering gaze of false sincerity. Women blushed. Some giggled. Some slapped him. 1 threw a pear. But what no one could figure out was why. Why was this otherwise unremarkable man, an unlanded gentleman of modest means, proposing to every eligible woman he crossed paths with? Why did he keep a small leather notebook, recording their names, dates, and responses as though he were filing tax returns? He wasn't doing it for money. He wasn't doing it for love. He wasn't even doing it for sport. At least, not in the usual sense. Henry's closest friend, a former seminary student named Miles, tried to get it out of him over ale. "If it's a wager, I'll match it," Miles said, sloshing his drink on the table. "There's no wager," Henry replied coolly. "Then what the devil is this about?" Henry looked at him. "The heart," he said. "It's about the heart." But no one quite believed him. By Thursday, the town had caught on. At the fish market, women turned their backs. At the dress shop, they leaned in, daring each other to meet his gaze. Some laughed and took bets. Others warned their daughters. One widow, notorious for being hard to impress, reportedly sighed and whispered, "At least he asks, bless him." And Henry kept going. Proposal number 17 took place outside a milliner's shop. Proposal 22, behind the library. Proposal 26, during a funeral procession, which earned him an actual punch from a grieving uncle. Still, no luck. No bride. But Henry didn't seem deterred. If anything, he was studying. Not the women themselves, but their reactions. He began making small adjustments. He tried quoting Shakespeare. He tried proposing in French. He carried a flower once, then a handkerchief, then a small caged bird. By Friday, his notebook was fuller than ever. Rejected. Miss Langley laughs, walks away. Miss Turner asks if I'm drunk. Widow Hargrave declines, flattered. And yet, the strangest part, some women began saying yes. Proposal 31. A shop girl with dimples and a curious mind. Yes, she said. Though I expect you won't remember my name tomorrow. Proposal 34. A maid, only 17, whispered her agreement, then giggled and ran off before he could write it down. Proposal 38. A school teacher. Why not? She said, eyeing him like an algebra problem. But Henry didn't follow up. He didn't schedule dates. He simply nodded, tipped his hat, and moved on, like a door-to-door salesman of dreams, not interested in closing the sale. By now, newspaper boys were shouting headlines about him. Madman proposes to dozens. Is it love or lunacy? Caricatures appeared. A cartoonish gentleman kneeling before a line of startled women, bouquet in one hand, ledger in the other. Henry's reputation spread like spilled ink. And yet, for all the gossip, no one had any idea what he was really after. Not even Henry. Because beneath the flamboyance, something quieter was ticking. A memory? A dare he made to himself. A heartbreak too old to admit? No one could say. Least of all him. But one thing was clear. This was no longer a joke. Not to the women. Not to the city. Not even to Henry. Something was building. And by Saturday, it would explode. By Saturday morning, Henry was a man transformed. He'd trimmed his coat, polished his boots, and tucked a pressed violet into his lapel. He stood on Boston's Commonwealth Avenue like a gentleman of opera, equal parts absurd and magnetic. And on his face was a look not of desperation, but determination. He was at Proposal 47. And the target, if one could call her that, was Miss Eliza Pembroke. Eliza was not like the others. Where most women giggled or blushed or scowled at Henry's sudden declarations, Eliza simply raised an eyebrow, the kind of cool, aristocratic brow that seemed to carry its own temperature. She was a governess, educated, plainly dressed, unimpressed by theatrics, unimpressed by Henry. In fact, she had already rejected him once. Back on Tuesday, proposal number 10, Henry had approached her outside the bookbinder's shop, offered her a tulip, and recited a line about destiny and shared futures. Eliza had smiled politely, accepted the flower, and replied, "You should save that line for someone who enjoys being spoken to like a second act in a play." And she walked off. Henry had recorded the rejection. But something about her tone, the calm confidence, the refusal to be charmed, had stayed with him. She hadn't laughed at him, or scolded him, or blushed. She'd just seen him. Now, 4 days and 36 proposals later, he stood before her again. "Miss Pembroke," he said, removing his hat, "I understand you already turned me down. And I respect that. But I believe I didn't quite say what I meant to say." Eliza, holding a stack of lesson plans, looked at him with mild curiosity. "And what did you mean to say, Mr. Barrow?" he said. "Henry Barrow." "Mr. Barrow. I'm listening." The street quieted. A few passers-by slowed their steps. The blacksmith's boy paused, mouth half open. Someone coughed. A sparrow chirped. Henry cleared his throat. "Miss Pembroke, I've asked 4 to 6 women to marry me this week. And I suppose I did it partly to prove something. Maybe to others. Maybe to myself. But in truth, I didn't expect any of them to say yes. Not really, because none of them were you." A silence bloomed like fog. Eliza looked down at her papers. "That's a very practiced speech, Mr. Barrow." "It wasn't rehearsed." "No. Then you must be more poet than suitor." Henry looked suddenly, painfully, sincere. "I don't want to keep proposing to women. I only did it because I thought no one would ever say yes and mean it. Because I thought love was theater. But when you said no, it felt different. It felt earned." Eliza exhaled softly. Not a sigh. Not amusement. Something gentler. She looked at him, truly looked, as if seeing past the powdered hair and waistcoat to the man beneath it all. "You're not in love with me, Mr. Barrow." "No," Henry admitted. "Not yet." "Then why ask again?" "Because you're the only one I'd want to fall in love with. The only one I'd bother to stay for after the curtain drops." Another silence. And then, slowly, Eliza smiled. "Mr. Barrow," she said, tucking her papers beneath one arm, "I'm going to say no. Again. Of course. But I will say this, if you ever propose to 4 to 7 more women, and come back to me with something better than a violet and a speech, I might reconsider." Henry blinked. "So you're saying, there's a chance?" "I'm saying," she said, turning to go, "you might try courting like a human being next time, not like a man in a storybook." And with that, she disappeared into the crowd. Henry didn't move for a long while. He just stood there, in the middle of Commonwealth Avenue, holding his hat in both hands, the violet limp in his lapel. Proposal number 4 to 7 had ended like all the rest, with a no. But for the first time all week, Henry didn't feel like a man collecting rejections. He felt like a man who'd been seen. He felt hopeful. He pulled out his notebook, drew a single line through Eliza Pembroke's name, and wrote beside it. Said no twice. Made it count. And then, for the first time in 7 days, he stopped proposing. For most of Boston, the week had passed without incident. Carriages rolled, factories whistled, and the post arrived on time. But in the small circles where gossip travels faster than mail, Henry Barrow had become a quiet legend. They whispered about him at corner shops, at seamstress tables, at afternoon teas. Not just because he had proposed to nearly 50 women, but because each of those women said no. And somehow, none of them regretted it. Mrs. Margaret Twilling, a baker's niece, told her sister she'd never felt so confident. "He knelt right in front of the flour sacks," she said, "and I told him I'd rather marry my rolling pin. And he just laughed. And left. No tears, no scorn. Just peace." Elsewhere, Miss Dorothea Vale, a shy schoolteacher with a stammer, confessed to her colleague that she'd never spoken so boldly to a man. "He asked me if I believed in soulmates," she said, "and I told him I believed in sensible shoes and long novels. I didn't blush. I didn't freeze. I felt taller." It was as if, somehow, Henry's flurry of absurd proposals had cracked open something deeper. Not romance. Not scandal. But a question. Why was it so rare to be asked, and to answer, without fear? Because in 19th century society, a woman's no often came at a cost. Say it too often, and you risked becoming unmarriageable. Say it too sharply, and you were labeled bitter. Say it without a smile, and you might never be asked again. But Henry, strange, well-dressed Henry, had given these women a kind of rehearsal. He asked. They answered. No strings. No shame. No whispers behind fans. It became, oddly, a kind of practice. A social warm-up. A test of spine. And some women, it seemed, found they had more spine than they thought. Miss Caroline Pratt, who'd once turned crimson at the sight of a gentleman, found herself confronting her employer, a man who'd borrowed her ideas and claimed them as his own. "I told him the same thing I told Mr. Barrow," she said, smiling. "No, sir. I don't belong to you. And I don't owe you yes." And even Eliza Pembroke, cool as she was, couldn't help but feel the shift. A week earlier, she'd walked through Boston like a shadow, unnoticed, unremarkable, unread. But now, strangers greeted her with nods. A few women thanked her for saying no twice, for standing firm, for not letting Henry's persistence turn into permission. Of course, not everyone approved. Some men scoffed. "It's mockery," said one banker. "A man shouldn't go around proposing like it's a market fair." Others called Henry foolish, unstable, attention-seeking. But even those men could feel it. Something had tilted. Something subtle and invisible and irreversible. Because one man's strange little mission had reminded an entire neighborhood that a woman's voice, even when saying no, was still a voice worth hearing. Meanwhile, Henry himself had disappeared. Not vanished, exactly. Just stepped aside. He no longer prowled the city with flowers and speeches. He stopped counting proposals. He even stopped polishing his boots. Instead, he took to walking by the harbor. quietly, alone. Some said he looked like a man broken-hearted. But Henry wasn't heartbroken. He was listening. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to perform, or prove, or win. He was letting silence teach him what words never had. And that, it turned out, was the beginning of something far more interesting than marriage. Henry's week of proposals had ended. He wasn't sure how many women he'd approached anymore. 4 to 7? 48. Maybe more. What he was sure of, however, was this. He was finished. He'd done what he came to do, even if he didn't fully understand what that was. So, on the 8th morning, he sat on a bench near the public gardens, hands folded neatly in his lap, as the world moved around him. No flowers. No note cards. No ring. Just Henry, quietly breathing in the aftermath of his own storm. And that's when she appeared. Not with fanfare. Not with music swelling. Just a polite, well-dressed woman, maybe 30, maybe less. She approached with slow steps and eyes that had already made a decision. "Mr. Barrow," she said. He looked up, surprised. Not because someone knew his name. At this point, nearly everyone did. But because she didn't look amused or outraged. She looked curious. "I heard you've been proposing to strangers," she said gently. Henry nodded, a little embarrassed. "I was. Yes. But I'm done." She smiled. It was the kind of smile you only learn after disappointment. Not cruel, not hopeful. Just real. "Then I'm sorry to be late," she said. "Because I came to say yes." Henry blinked. No violin played. No birds chirped in approval. It was just a quiet moment, dangling between joke and miracle. "I beg your pardon. You proposed to my cousin," she said. "Emily Delrose. And to my friend Catherine. And to my piano teacher." "I see," Henry said, unsure where this was going. "They all said no. But I thought, perhaps I'd like to say yes. Not because I believe in whirlwind romance. Or because I think we're soulmates. But because I think what you did was brave. And absurd. And maybe what I need." Henry didn't speak. For the first time, words, his constant tool, his sword and shield, had failed him. So she sat beside him, calm as the pond, and continued. "I don't want a proposal," she said. "I want a conversation. A walk. Maybe a coffee." He chuckled, finally exhaling the tension he hadn't realized he'd held. "That," he said, "I can do." And so, without ceremony, without witnesses or bouquets, they walked. Through the gardens, down Commonwealth Avenue, across the bridge. And something about that walk felt more honest than any of the speeches Henry had given all week. He didn't try to impress her. She didn't try to dazzle him. They just spoke. She told him about her failed engagement. He told her about the day he quit his job. She talked about grief. He talked about shame. And as the sun dipped low over the city, it became clear. This wasn't the end of a joke. It was the beginning of a story neither of them had written yet. But here's the thing. That woman, her name was Evelyn, never married Henry. Not in the traditional sense. They didn't rush into anything. They didn't move in together. There was no wedding, no announcement in the paper. What they shared was more scandalous than love. They became companions. Friends who strolled at midnight. Confidants who wrote each other letters long after they could just speak. And over time, people stopped asking when they'd tie the knot. Because they seemed to have already done something better. They chose each other, again and again, without needing to sign a contract. Meanwhile, Henry's strange tale didn't vanish. In fact, it spread. Stories of the man who proposed to 4 to 7 women in 7 days crossed state lines. Newspapers in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and even as far as St. Louis ran cheeky columns about Boston's most peculiar bachelor. Most assumed he was a fool. Some called him a romantic. But a few, just a few, understood the real genius of what he'd done. He turned the most sacred question in society, "Will you marry me?" into a mirror. Not for love, but for fear, for freedom, for self-worth. And somehow, that mirror helped dozens of women rediscover their own reflection. Henry Barrow never sought fame. He never wrote a memoir. He never explained himself. But if you ask the older women of Boston, the ones who were young once, who remember that odd little week in 1875, they'll tell you something curious. They'll say, We never married Henry Barrow. But we remember him. Because for once, a man asked us something. And let us answer freely. By 1910, Henry Barrow's name had nearly vanished. The city had changed. Streetcars buzzed through Boston. Women marched for the vote. The corset was losing its grip, and new ideas about marriage, love, and freedom were blooming in places Henry would never see. He lived quietly, never remarried, never gave speeches, never told the story himself. Most who remembered the week of proposals were older now, widowed, gray-haired, or tucked away in family homes, their memories folded into the wallpaper. But sometimes, when the younger generation asked about those days, the old women would smile, as if recalling a dream. There was a man, they'd say. He wore a green coat and carried tulips. And he asked a question no one else dared ask. Of course, the story changed with time. Some said he was a lunatic. Others called him a tragic romantic. One popular retelling insisted he'd proposed to 100 women, then disappeared into the sea. But Evelyn knew the truth. Long after Henry died, quietly, in a rented room with his books, she still took her evening walks. Still stopped by the gardens. Still looked at young couples and wondered how many of them were brave enough to be honest. She kept every letter he wrote. Never showed them to anyone. Not even when asked. It was never about the proposals, she said once, to a niece who pressed for the full story. It was about permission. To want something. To risk shame for a chance at meaning. Today, there's no plaque for Henry Barrow. No monument. No street name. But if you walk through Boston Common in early spring, just as the first tulips open, you might feel it. A soft tug in the air. Like a question that hasn't been asked in a very long time. And if you listen carefully, it might whisper. Will you say yes?